Good evening, everybody. Today is the 25th, and we are going to discuss episode 8 of the Lynette Hooker case. As the first week of April ended, investigators began shifting away from the immediate shoreline response and into a deeper review of the timeline. The early statements, weather conditions, and report sequence of events were no longer aligning as cleanly as they had during the first 48 hours. On April 7th, authorities continued interviewing boaters and reviewing the accounts that had already been collected. There were conflicting descriptions of the conditions on the water. Some drift information raised questions about whether the reported location matched the natural movement of the current that day. The timing of when Lynette was last seen versus when she was reported missing showed gaps. Investigators could not yet reconcile with any of these things. On April 7th, there was something else that came into play. There was a phone call. It was made by Brian, and he decided that he was going to call some friends of his that him and Lynette had met years before at sea. While authorities struggled to piece together the official logbook, Brian Hooker was busy trying to control the narrative outside of the investigation. On that very same day, April 7th, Brian made a 40-minute phone call to Blaine and Marnie Stevenson. He did not know that the call was being recorded, and he spent those 40 minutes talking extensively, trying to explain away the gaps in his story. But the Stevensons already knew a truth that Brian was desperate to hide. They knew that 2 years earlier, during a brief separation in 2024, Lynette had sent private, frantic text messages to her friend Marnie. She didn't paint a picture of a happy life at sea. Instead, she wrote that the marriage had gotten real bad. She explicitly stated, "I can't be out here with him," adding, "We decided to call it quits. I'm not going back." She did ultimately go back. For a reconciliation, they had stayed apart for approximately 30 days. So this added another layer to the investigation. Was there something else going on behind the scenes that they were not aware of? So these new pieces of evidence left a chilling realization in their wake. The timeline of her disappearance wasn't just an administrative puzzle anymore. It was the final chapter of a long, simmering crisis between the two of them. On April 9th, drift, modeling, and local mariner input continued to challenge the original narrative. The reported location did not fully match the expected drift pattern for that day's winds and currents. Experienced boaters questioned whether the conditions described were consistent with the timeline provided. Investigators continued gathering statements from anyone who had been on the water that week. On April 10th, the Royal Bahamians Police Force expanded the scope of the investigation. Additional interviews were conducted, and the sequence of events leading up to April 4th were reviewed once again. The focus began moving from search and rescue toward verifying the timeline itself. This period marked the transition into a more complex investigation that would eventually involve multiple jurisdictions and place soulmate at the very center of this case. On April 8th, Brian was officially detained by the Bahamian police. Brian was held and interrogated by the police for 5 days before being released without formal charges due to lack of physical evidence. But his freedom did not mean he was in the clear. Behind the scenes, the U.S. Coast Guard Investigative Service immediately opened a parallel criminal probe into the disappearance of Lynette. Over the weeks that followed, federal agents tracked the yacht, eventually staging a dramatic interception of the Soulmate 40 nautical miles off the Florida coast, seizing the vessel to process it for forensic data. In the early days of the search, there had been days that were filled with urgency, there were days that were filled with some hope, and there were days that belief that answers still might come. But by the end of the 10th of the month, that feeling began to shift. The story no longer fit nearby. It didn't fit into the narrative. It didn't fit into anything. The family could not understand that Lynette could have just fallen off the boat, disappeared into the night, especially with her physical condition and being able to swim as well as she did. Nothing was matching. They were stressed. They were so far away, and they felt like there was nothing they could do. The timeline of all of this just did not match, but it didn't just match for them. The investigators were beginning to feel it. They were seeing it, and they were hearing it. For those watching from the outside, the case still looked like a missing person search, but behind the scenes, the tone was changing. The questions were becoming more sharp. The inconsistencies were getting harder and harder to ignore, and the focus was slowly moving away from the water, and it was moving toward the boat that had carried the last known moments of what we know of Lynette Hooker's life. So I'm going to conclude there, and we are going to go at a faster rate and get caught up on this case. I did start off a little bit behind because I wanted to give a pretty in-depth narrative of who Lynette is and who she was prior to her life at sea. If you missed any of the other episodes, 1 through 7, you can get caught back up, and this one, episode 8, is waiting for you to review, and I would love to see your comments. Thank you very much, and have a good evening.